Ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, I come to you today with a message straight from the heart. It's a message for the wounded and weary, for the forgotten and forsaken, for those who feel like life has left them unprotected, uncared for, and uncovered. Today, I'm here to tell you you're still covered. You see, life can have a way of stripping us bare. It can knock the breath out of us and leave us feeling exposed. Maybe you felt the cold winds of rejection, the burning sting of betrayal, the crushing weight of failure. Maybe life has pulled at the seams of your dreams, tugged at the fabric of your confidence, unraveled the threads of your hope. But I came to remind you today, you're still covered. God's covering is permanent. This truth, while simple, holds a depth that speaks directly to our human experience of feeling exposed, vulnerable, and sometimes forgotten. We often encounter circumstances where we're stripped of security, facing trials that challenge our sense of protection and purpose. Maybe it's a job that fell through, a relationship that ended abruptly, or a health crisis that left us physically and emotionally drained. These moments feel like they rip the very fabric of who we are. And yet through all of life's storms, there is one covering that remains unshakable, immovable, and unbreakable: God's covering. To understand the power of this covering, think about what it means to be truly covered. In human terms, covering provides a shield or barrier between us and the forces that could cause us harm. A covering blocks the wind, shields from rain, and shelters from the cold. It is something we can rely on to keep us protected, safe, and warm. Now imagine this idea of covering on a spiritual level, not as something that can be torn or worn out, but as a divine promise. God's covering isn't like a temporary shelter that lasts only in good weather or ideal conditions. It's not dependent on your actions, your worthiness, or how you feel. His covering is an eternal promise that withstands every season, every storm, and every trial. God's covering is not something we earn. We live in a world that teaches us to work for what we have, to put effort into our successes, and to continually prove our worth. But God's love and protection are not based on what we do, they are based on who He is. He is steadfast, faithful, and unchanging. His covering over your life is a reflection of His commitment to you. It isn't something that fluctuates based on the winds of change in your life, nor is it something that shifts based on your mistakes or triumphs. His covering is established from the moment He called you His own. Just as a parent would guard their child in a storm, God's commitment to cover us is an unbreakable vow. This covering also represents a sense of belonging. When you are covered by God, you are held within the protection of His arms, within the safety of His love. Sometimes people might walk away. Friends can disappoint. Family members might not understand, but the covering of God says, you belong to me. There is no rejection in Him, no abandonment, and no exclusion. His covering speaks of an acceptance that is pure, whole, and unwavering. It is a refuge that says you are known, seen, and loved. No amount of mistakes or failures can separate you from this covering, because it's not about what you bring to the table. It's about the immeasurable love He brings to you. Moreover, God's covering is inclusive of every part of you. We tend to think of protection in terms of external circumstances, protection from harm, from danger, from failure. But His covering goes deeper. God's covering includes every part of your life, your thoughts, your dreams, your worries, your hopes, and your doubts. He covers every part of you, even the parts you try to hide from the world, and sometimes even from yourself. God knows every inch of your being, the fears you can't voice, the dreams you're afraid to pursue, and the wounds you can't seem to heal. And yet His covering wraps around every part, healing, mending, and holding together what feels broken. There will be times when you may not feel this covering. Moments will arise when you feel vulnerable, exposed, and alone. But just as a child might not understand the unseen hand of a parent guiding them away from danger, there are countless ways God's covering is at work in your life that you may not see. He's present in the spaces between our questions, in the silence of our doubts, in the midnight hour when we cry out for help. He covers us even when we're not aware of His presence, even when we don't acknowledge His hand. God's covering is not limited by our awareness. It is faithful and unrelenting, protecting us when we cannot protect ourselves. In a world where so much is temporary, God's covering is a foundation. We experience moments when things we depended on fail or people we trusted leave. Jobs can come and go, health can change in an instant, and relationships can shift. But through all of life's uncertainties, His covering is the rock beneath your feet. It is the assurance that no matter what else is taken away, His love, His presence, and His protection remain. God's covering is the shelter you can run to when everything else has crumbled around you. It is a source of strength when you have none, a well of peace when your heart is troubled. God's covering is also proactive. He doesn't just shelter us from harm, he prepares us for our purpose. God's covering not only keeps us safe, but equips us, strengthens us, and emboldens us to step into who we are called to be. It is a covering that says, not only will I protect you, but I will position you. God's covering places us in situations that challenge, stretch, and grow us, knowing that we are shielded by his grace and led by his wisdom. His covering doesn't just prevent harm, it guides us toward growth, purpose, and fulfillment. Finally, God's covering is his promise of love, one that is eternal and unbreakable. The same God who promises to never leave nor forsake us also promises that nothing can separate us from his love. When God covers you, he commits to you fully. His protection is a result of his profound, unyielding love for you, a love that sees beyond your shortcomings and embraces you in your entirety. His covering is a manifestation of this perfect love, one that outlasts every trial, outshines every hardship, and outweighs every doubt. God's covering is his unending commitment to you, one that stands firm regardless of what life brings. No storm, no disappointment, and no failure can undo it. His covering is woven into the very essence of who he is, faithful, loving, and eternal. It is permanent, unbreakable, and secure. Through every season and every challenge, you are covered. God's covering is not just something that surrounds us in moments of strength. It is most profoundly felt in times of weakness. When we are vulnerable, we are at our lowest. That is when God's covering becomes a lifeline, a refuge, and a powerful reminder of his constant presence in our lives. So in moments of weakness, it's easy to feel as though we're abandoned, to feel like our struggles are too much to bear. The weight of challenges, the sting of disappointments, and the heartbreak of failure can all make us feel isolated and fragile. But here's the truth: God's strength is perfected in our weakness. In the very moments we feel we have nothing left, that's when God steps in with his limitless power and grace, covering us in ways we may not fully understand, but can deeply feel. Life has a way of testing our strength, of pushing us to the very edges of our endurance. There are seasons when we feel so overwhelmed that we're unsure how we'll make it through. We carry burdens that seem unbearable. We face situations that seem insurmountable, and we find ourselves at the end of our own strength. We may try to stay strong, to keep pushing, but there comes a point when our human limits are reached. It's in these moments when we feel empty and powerless that God's covering is the strongest. His covering is not there just to keep us safe. It is there to empower us when we have no strength left of our own. God doesn't wait for us to be strong on our own. He meets us in our weakness, wrapping us in a covering of his strength, peace, and assurance. Weakness is not something we're usually comfortable with. Society teaches us to be self-sufficient, to be resilient, and to handle our own problems. There's often a fear of admitting that we're struggling or that we need help. But God operates on a different principle. He doesn't see weakness as something to be ashamed of. He sees it as an opportunity to show his power in our lives. When we are willing to admit our limitations, to acknowledge that we cannot do it all on our own, we open the door for God's covering to move in our lives in a powerful way. His strength is made perfect in our weakness because it's in those vulnerable places that his love, grace, and power shine the brightest. God is not looking for us to have it all together. He is looking for hearts willing to trust in his covering when we cannot carry the weight ourselves. There is a profound comfort in knowing that God's covering does not depend on our own ability to hold things together. When we are weak, God's covering surrounds us, not as a reminder of our limitations, but as a declaration of his power. He doesn't need us to be strong all the time. In fact, he understands that we will face moments where our own strength is not enough. God's covering is a promise that in these moments we don't have to rely on ourselves. His covering reminds us that we can lean on him, that we can rest in his strength when ours is failing. This covering becomes a source of peace because it assures us that we are not expected to handle every burden alone. We are invited to let go, to release our worries, our fears, and our struggles into his hands. His covering doesn't require us to carry every load. It invites us to release those loads to him. God's covering also provides a level of protection that goes beyond our understanding. In our weakness, we may feel like easy targets for negativity, for doubt, for fear, and for despair. It's easy to become overwhelmed by these things when we are already struggling. But God's covering shields us from these forces. He protects our hearts and minds, guarding us from the lies that try to creep in during our vulnerable moments. He speaks truth to us when we feel surrounded by darkness, reminding us that we are loved, that we are loved, valued, and we are valued, and that we are loved. Even when the world around us feels chaotic and threatening, God's covering remains a fortress, a place where we can find peace and security. In moments of weakness, we often feel like we have nothing left to give. We feel drained, exhausted, and empty. But God's covering is there to fill the spaces where we feel lacking. He pours his love and strength into us, replenishing what has been drained by life's challenges. God's covering is not just a shield, it is a source of renewal. When we feel like we have reached our end, he steps in and offers us rest and restoration. This is not a covering that merely protects and revives. It breathes life into weary souls, giving us the strength to continue, even when we thought we had no strength left. God's covering in our weakness also serves as a reminder that we are not defined by our limitations. Society may look at weakness as a flaw, as something that makes us less capable or less worthy. But God's covering reminds us that our identity is not based on our ability to handle everything on our own. In fact, it is often through our weakness that God does his greatest work. He takes the very areas where we feel broken or insufficient and uses them as places to show his power. Our weaknesses, covered by God's grace, become testimonies of his faithfulness. They become reminders that we don't have to be perfect to be loved or to have a purpose. God's covering redefines our weaknesses, turning them into spaces where his strength is revealed. In those times when we feel weak and helpless, God's covering is a reminder of his compassion. He does not scorn us for our weaknesses. Instead, he draws closer, offering comfort and support. He sees the struggles that others may not see, the private battles we face, and the silent tears we cry. His covering is a statement of his empathy, a demonstration of his understanding. God does not stand at a distance watching us struggle. He comes close, wrapping us in his love and offering the assurance that we are not alone. His covering is a tangible reminder that we are deeply cared for, even in our most vulnerable moments. God's covering also teaches us to be patient with ourselves. When we are weak, it's easy to feel frustrated, to feel like we're not enough. But God's covering encourages us to show ourselves grace, to recognize that it's okay to need help, to need rest, and to rely on him. His covering is a reminder that our worth is not based on our ability to be strong all the time. It is based on his love for us, a love that is constant, unchanging, and unbreakable. His covering allows us to rest, to find peace, and to trust that his strength is sufficient for every need. God's covering in our weakness is a profound gift. It is a promise that we are never alone, never without support, and never beyond his reach. It assures us that even in our lowest moments, we are held in his strength, wrapped in his love, and surrounded by his grace. God's covering is an incredible assurance, especially in times when we feel the weight of our own mistakes. There is an innate human tendency to feel that our shortcomings define us, that our errors somehow distance us from God. But the truth of God's grace and covering goes beyond our flaws, faults, and failures. His love is so deep and his mercy so abundant that he covers us even in our worst moments. When we fall short, God's covering doesn't shrink back, it envelops us, reminding us that his grace is greater than any mistake we can make. We all know what it feels like to mess up, to fall short of our own standards, or even worse, to feel like we've disappointed God. Sometimes these mistakes are small, like losing our temper or speaking out of frustration, but other times they are the kinds of mistakes that keep us up at night, mistakes that make us question who we are. Shame and guilt have a way of isolating us, creating a wall between who we want to be and who we think we are because of our actions. But here's where God's covering transforms everything. His covering isn't based on our ability to do right all the time. It's based on his endless love and commitment to us. He doesn't look at us with condemnation, but with compassion, eager to restore us, not reject us. In God's eyes, mistakes are not the end of the story. The covering of his grace ensures that we are not defined by our errors, but by his love. Many times people feel that they must carry the weight of their mistakes alone, that somehow bearing the burden of guilt and regret will make things right. But God's covering invites us to let go of that burden. He knows every mistake we've made, and yet he chooses to cover us. This covering is not a passive acceptance of our wrongs, but an active, relentless pursuit of our hearts. God wants us to come to him with our brokenness, our regrets, and our failures so he can cover them with his grace and restore us to a place of wholeness. It is through his covering that we learn that our identity is not tied to our failures, it's tied to his forgiveness. There's something incredibly powerful in knowing that God's covering doesn't leave us exposed. When we make mistakes, it can feel like we're left vulnerable to judgment, both from others and from ourselves. But God's covering is a shield against shame, a refuge from guilt, and a sanctuary where we can find peace and healing. In the safety of his covering, we are able to see our mistakes not as defining failures, but as opportunities for growth and transformation. God doesn't want us to be trapped by our mistakes. He wants us to be set free by his forgiveness. His covering allows us to move forward without the weight of past errors holding us back. In his presence, our mistakes are met with mercy, not judgment. This covering of grace also teaches us that God sees us through a lens of love, not disappointment. While we often focus on our shortcomings, God sees our potential. His covering is a reminder that we are more than the sum of our mistakes. In fact, God can use our mistakes to draw us closer to him, to teach us, to refine us, and to shape us into who he has called us to be. When we bring our mistakes to God, he doesn't shame us, he redeems us. He uses our flaws as a canvas for his grace, showing us that even our worst moments can be transformed by his love. We don't have to hide or pretend to be perfect because God's covering welcomes us just as we are, mistakes and all. God's covering also means that his love is unchanging, even when we fail. Human love can be conditional, often dependent on our behavior or achievements, but God's love remains constant regardless of our actions. His covering assures us that we are loved not because of what we do, but because of who he is. This kind of love is life-changing. It breaks down the walls of fear and insecurity that arise when we make mistakes. God's covering lets us know that we are never too far gone, never beyond redemption, and never out of reach. His love is a shelter that withstands every storm, including the storms we create ourselves. When we understand that God's covering is there even in our failures, it changes the way we see ourselves. We no longer have to live in fear of falling short or making mistakes because we know that God's grace is big enough to cover any failure. This realization gives us the courage to keep going, to keep trying, and to keep growing. We don't have to be perfect to be covered by God's love. We simply have to be willing to receive it. His covering allows us to forgive ourselves, to let go of past regrets, and to step into the future with hope. The covering of God's grace also reminds us of his patience. God knows that we are works in progress. He sees our efforts, our intentions, and even our struggles, and he doesn't rush us to perfection. His covering is there every step of the way, encouraging us, guiding us, and picking us up when we stumble. God doesn't give up on us because of our mistakes. He continues to walk with us, helping us to grow and mature. His covering is a promise that he will never abandon us, even in our worst moments. His love remains constant, his mercy remains available, and his grace remains abundant. Through God's covering, we find the freedom to be honest with ourselves and with him. We can acknowledge our mistakes without fear because we know that his love will not waver. God's covering gives us the confidence to face our failures head on, knowing that they do not define us. He has called us his own, and nothing, not even our worst mistakes, can change that. God's covering is an invitation to live without the fear of failure, to embrace his grace, and to walk boldly in the knowledge that we are loved unconditionally. In moments of regret, God's covering speaks a powerful truth that we are forgiven, redeemed, and deeply cherished. His love is not deterred by our mistakes. Instead, it reaches through them, offering us a way forward. God's covering teaches us that his grace is not just a one-time gift. It is a continual presence in our lives, available to us every day, every moment, and every time we fall. We are covered by a love that does not diminish, a grace that does not run out, and a mercy that is new every morning. God's covering is a constant reminder that we are his, that our mistakes do not define us, and that his grace is sufficient. It is a covering that invites us to rise above our failures, to embrace his forgiveness, and to live in the freedom that only his love can provide. No matter how many times we fall, his covering is there to lift us up, to restore us, and to remind us that we are deeply, irrevocably loved. One of the most reassuring aspects of God's covering is his unwavering presence in our lives. This presence is not fleeting, nor does it diminish based on our circumstances, actions, or moods. God promises to be with us in every season, in every trial, and through every joy, This unbreakable promise of his presence is a covering that offers us comfort and peace, knowing that no matter where we go, he is with us. When life brings challenges, uncertainties, or moments of loneliness, God's covering reminds us that we are never alone, that his presence surrounds us like a shield and fills us with hope and courage. In a world where people come and go, where relationships can be fragile, and where circumstances often change, it's easy to feel abandoned or isolated. Sometimes those closest to us may leave, disappoint, or be unable to understand the depths of our struggles. But God's covering is different. It is steadfast, eternal, and unaffected by the shifting tides of life. His presence is a constant source of companionship, a steady hand guiding us and a loving heart understanding us. God does not only visit us in times of need, he abides with us. His covering is the assurance that we are not left to fend for ourselves. It is his way of saying, I am here, and I will never leave you nor forsake you. This truth becomes especially powerful in times of hardship. When trials come, it's natural to question whether God is still with us. Difficult circumstances can make us feel like he has withdrawn, that we're left to struggle on our own. But God's covering promises us that his presence is most powerful in our struggles, most evident when we feel weak and alone. He is not a God who distances himself when things get tough. Instead, he draws closer. He covers us with his presence, whispering peace into our hearts, strengthening us from within, and providing the resilience to keep moving forward. Even when we cannot feel him or see how he's working, his presence is there, surrounding us with love and assurance. God's covering is not just an external protection, it is a deeply intimate presence within us. Through his spirit, he dwells within our hearts, guiding, comforting, and teaching us. He is not a distant God who observes from afar. He is a close, personal, and caring presence. This closeness allows us to share every detail of our lives with him, from our greatest joys to our deepest sorrows. In moments of loneliness, we can talk to him, knowing he listens with compassion. In times of confusion, we can seek his guidance, trusting that he will illuminate our path. This inner presence is a part of his covering, a reminder that we are never truly alone. He understands us even more deeply than we understand ourselves, and he remains with us through every season of life. This unshakable presence also serves as a source of peace that surpasses understanding. When we face anxiety or fear, it's natural to feel overwhelmed. We may worry about the future, about situations beyond our control, or about the unknown. But God's covering gives us peace by reminding us that he is already there at every moment we have yet to face. He knows what lies ahead, and he promises to walk with us every step of the way. His presence reassures us that we don't have to figure everything out on our own or carry every burden alone. We can rest in his peace, knowing that he is with us fighting our battles, calming our fears, and guiding us through every valley. The covering of God's presence also strengthens our sense of identity. In a world that often defines us by our achievements, appearances, or what others think of us, God's covering speaks a different truth. His presence in our lives tells us that we are loved, chosen, and valuable just as we are. We are not defined by what we do or by what others say about us. We are defined by his love. When we are covered by his presence, we can stand confidently knowing that we are his beloved children. His love gives us a foundation that no storm can shake. We are free to live authentically, to pursue our purpose, and to find our worth in his unchanging view of us. God's covering is a source of courage as well. When we know that God is with us, we can face any challenge with boldness. We may still experience fear, doubt, or uncertainty, but his presence reminds us that we are not facing these things alone. With him by our side, we can step into situations that might otherwise seem intimidating or overwhelming. His covering gives us the strength to rise above our limitations, to push past our insecurities, and to take on challenges that seem beyond us. We are emboldened to walk in faith, to take risks, and to trust that wherever we go, he goes with us. In addition to comfort and strength, God's covering provides us with divine guidance. His presence is like a lamp to our feet, illuminating the path ahead. Life often presents us with difficult decisions, moments when we are unsure of the next step. But God's covering ensures that we are not navigating life's complexities alone. He offers us wisdom, direction, and insight. When we seek his presence, he faithfully leads us, aligning our hearts with his will. His guidance may not always come in the way we expect or at the time we desire, but his covering is a reminder that we can trust him completely. He sees the bigger picture, understands what we need, and is committed to leading us in the way that is best for us. God's presence as our covering also means that we have access to his power. He is not only with us, he empowers us. When we feel weak, his strength sustains us. When we feel incapable, his power equips us. God's covering is not merely passive, it is active, infusing us with the courage, resilience, and capability we need to fulfill our purpose. His presence gives us the ability to do things we could never do on our own. It is his spirit working through us, enabling us to make a difference, to love deeply, and to persevere in the face of obstacles. We are not only protected by his covering, we are strengthened by it, filled with his power to carry out the work he has set before us. When God says you're covered, it means that no matter what comes your way, his promises over your life are secure. God's promises are not conditional based on our circumstances, our feelings, or the straining, or the struggles we face. His promises are steadfast, firm, and unshakable. Even when we walk through seasons of doubt or fear, his promises do not waver. His covering is a reminder that every word he has spoken, every blessing he has declared, and every assurance he has given remains true. God's promises are like a foundation, a rock that cannot be moved by the storms of life. This covering is the certainty that his promises will stand, giving us hope, peace, and strength to persevere. The promises of God are not mere words, they are the essence of his character. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a human being that he should change his mind. When he speaks, his words are rooted in his nature, in his unchanging love, and in his infinite wisdom. His promises are his commitment to us, his children. Even in times when we feel unworthy, he remains faithful. God's promises are bound not by our performance, but by his nature, which is pure, holy, and forever committed to us. Because of his covering, we can have complete confidence in his promises, knowing that they will come to pass because he is faithful. God's covering is the assurance that his promises are already working in our lives, even when we cannot yet see their fulfillment. When we are in the midst of struggles, it can be hard to see God's promises coming to pass. We may feel discouraged or wonder if we're on the right path, but God's covering tells us that he is working behind the scenes. His promises are not idle words, they are actively unfolding, often in ways we don't immediately recognize. Just because we cannot see the promise doesn't mean it isn't in progress. God's covering gives us the patience to wait, the endurance to keep moving forward, and the faith to believe that his promises are already at work, laying the foundation for his purpose in our lives. In times of doubt, God's covering serves as a reminder of his promises. Life has a way of testing our faith, of making us question if God's promises will really come true. We encounter setbacks, disappointments, and struggles that can make us wonder if God's words over our lives were real. But God's covering brings us back to the truth. It reminds us of his faithfulness throughout history, of the many promises he has fulfilled for those who trusted in him. From the parting of the Red Sea to the resurrection of Jesus, God's covering is woven with countless reminders of his promise-keeping nature. His covering reassures us that he has been faithful before, and that he will be faithful again, not only in our own lives, but for generations to come. When we feel surrounded by challenges, God's covering reminds us of his promises of protection and provision. The Bible is filled with declarations of God's desire to shield us from harm, to provide for our needs, and to walk with us through every storm. He promises that even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil, for he is with us. This is not an empty promise, it is a covering that offers real, tangible protection. We are covered by a God who does not just watch from a distance, but who actively intervenes in our lives. His covering is the assurance that we are safe, that he will guard our hearts and minds, and that he will provide every need according to his riches and glory. The covering of God's promises also gives us strength in times of waiting. Waiting can be one of the hardest parts of our journey. We pray, we hope, and we trust, but sometimes God's promises take time to unfold. In these seasons, it can be easy to feel forgotten or to wonder if God's promises are really for us. But God's covering is a reminder that his timing is perfect, that every delay is purposeful, and that his promises are never late. Waiting is not a passive act, it's an active posture of faith, a choice to trust that God's promises are worth the wait. His covering gives us the patience to endure, to hold on to hope, and to remain steadfast, knowing that in his perfect time, every promise will be fulfilled. God's promises also bring us hope for the future, even in the face of uncertainty. We live in a world filled with change and unpredictability. Circumstances can shift in an instant, leaving us wondering what lies ahead. But God's covering reminds us that his promises extend beyond our present circumstances. He has plans to give us a future and a hope, plans that cannot be thwarted by the challenges we face today. His promises are not confined to our current reality. They are declarations over our entire lives. God's covering is a constant reminder that no matter what tomorrow holds, his promises remain secure, giving us hope and strength to walk boldly into the future. God's covering assures us that his promises of love and acceptance are unchanging. The world often judges us by our actions, achievements, or appearance, but God's promises are rooted in his unconditional love. He promises to love us with an everlasting love, a love that covers all our mistakes, shortcomings, and insecurities. His covering reminds us that we don't have to earn his love or prove his love or prove our worth. His promises are declarations of his love for us just as we are. In times when we doubt our value or struggle with self-worth, his covering surrounds us with the truth of his love. He is a God who sees beyond our flaws, who values us deeply, and who calls us his own. His promises give us the freedom to live confidently, knowing that we are loved beyond measure. God's covering of promises also means that we are empowered to live a life of purpose. His promises are not only about what he will do for us, they are also about what he will do through us. He promises to equip us, to guide us, and to give us everything we need to fulfill the calling he has placed on our lives. His covering is the assurance that we are not only protected but empowered. We are covered by his promises to be courageous, to step out in faith, and to make a difference in the world. His covering reminds us that we are capable, that we have been chosen, and that his promises will enable us to accomplish things beyond our own ability. God's covering through his promises is a reminder that we are held, cherished, and deeply loved. His promises are not distant or abstract. They are personal, specific, and intimate. He knows our needs, our desires, and our fears, and his promises address each one. His covering gives us the confidence to walk in faith, to live in hope, and to trust in his love. God's promises are a constant source of encouragement, reminding us that we are never alone, that we are always loved, and that his plan for our lives is filled with purpose, hope, and blessing. His covering assures us that his promises will prevail, giving us the strength to face each day with unwavering faith and a heart full of gratitude. God's covering means that we are protected from the forces we cannot see, shielded from battles we may not even know are taking place. Life is filled with spiritual challenges and unseen forces that try to disrupt, discourage, and even derail us from our purpose. There are moments when things seem to fall apart, when circumstances grow overwhelming, or we feel inexplicably burdened by fears or doubts. Yet in the midst of these moments, God's covering is an invisible shield of protection. It's promised that even when we are unaware, he is fighting on our behalf. This covering is not something we can touch or see, but it is a powerful assurance that we are never vulnerable in his care. God's protection extends beyond our understanding, safeguarding us from the forces that we do not know exist, allowing us to walk in faith rather than in fear. Imagine a parent standing guard over a sleeping child, aware of every sound, every potential danger, and fully prepared to step in if anything threatens that child's peace. God's covering works in a similar way. He watches over us day and night, his eyes always on us, attentive to every aspect of our lives. Even while we are unaware, resting or moving through the sides of our days, God is actively protecting us. He places angels around us, watching over us with unwavering attention, intervening in ways we may never recognize. His protection is not dependent on our awareness or our ability to defend ourselves. It is a gift of his love, a constant presence that guards us from harm. When we trust in God's covering, we can rest in the knowledge that he sees what we cannot, and he fights battles we don't even know are being waged. God's covering also acts as a barrier between us and the plans of the enemy. The enemy works through deception, trying to plant seeds of doubt, fear, and insecurity in our hearts. He wants us to feel helpless, to think that we are without hope, and to believe that we are alone in our struggles. But God's covering is a fortress, an unbreakable wall of protection that guards us against these attacks. Through his covering, God guards our minds and our hearts, helping us to stand firm in the truth of his promises. When doubts arise or fears try to overwhelm us, we can lean on God's covering, allowing his truth to drown out the lies of the enemy. His protection is more than just physical, it shields our very souls, keeping us grounded in faith and immune to the discouragement that the enemy wants us to feel. In times of trial, God's covering is our refuge. The world is unpredictable and trials can come at any moment. There are times when life presents us with challenges we never anticipated, obstacles that seem insurmountable, or losses that leave us feeling vulnerable and exposed. It's in these moments that God's covering becomes our place of safety. He invites us to find refuge in him, to shelter under his wings, and to know that we are secure in his care. His covering doesn't mean that we won't face hardships, but it does mean that we won't face them alone. He is with us, shielding us from despair, filling us with hope, and offering us peace that surpasses understanding. When life gets overwhelming, God's covering reminds us that we can come to him, lay down our burdens, and find comfort in his unshakable presence. God's covering also protects us from the weight of our own anxieties. In a world that is filled with reasons to worry, God's covering reminds us that He is in control. We don't have to live with the burden of fear or the pressure to manage everything on our own. God knows our every need, our every concern, and His covering is a shield that allows us to release those anxieties into His hands. He tells us to cast our cares on Him because He cares for us, and His covering makes it possible to actually live that out. We don't have to carry the weight of the unknown, of future fears, or of daily stresses because God's covering gives us permission to let go. In His protection, we find the freedom to trust, to believe that He is working all things for our good, and to know that nothing can reach us without first going through His hands. God's covering also means that we are safeguarded from past mistakes and future fears. Often we carry the scars of our past, feeling as if our history defines us or limits what God can do in our lives. The enemy uses our past mistakes to remind us of our failures, to make us feel undeserving of God's protection or love. But God's covering is a reminder that our past does not define us as love and grace do. He covers us not only from external threats, but from the internal ones as well, the shame, guilt, and regret that try to rob us of our peace. Under His covering, we are new creations free from the bondage of our past. We can move forward in confidence, knowing that we are not defined by where we've been, but by where He is leading us. His covering secures our future, allowing us to walk boldly without fear of what lies ahead, knowing that He goes before us, making the way. The covering of God's protection also allows us to love others without fear. The world often teaches us to be guarded, to protect ourselves from being hurt by others. But under God's covering, we are empowered to love boldly, to reach out without fear, and to live generously. When we are covered by God's love and protection, we don't have to worry about being taken advantage of or hurt because we know that He is our ultimate protector. We can give freely, knowing that He will replenish us, and we can forgive others, knowing that He guards our hearts. God's covering makes it possible to love in a way that reflects His love for us unconditionally, fearlessly, and with an open heart. God's covering is not limited by our human understanding. We might not always comprehend how He protects us or recognize the dangers from which He shields us, but we can trust that His ways are higher than ours. He is the creator of all things, the one who sees the beginning and the end, and His protection is perfect. We don't need to understand every aspect of His covering. We simply need to trust that He is faithful. God's covering is a mystery in many ways, but it is a mystery rooted in love, a divine assurance that we are constantly surrounded by His care. This is a covering that allows us to rest, to release control, and to trust that God's love will never let us go. We are held, protected, and watched over by a God who is far greater than any force we could face, giving us confidence to live in the freedom of His protection.